So this is the gap I'm talking about. There are various ways to describe it. Carl Branting in this article compares data-centric models and logic-based models and shows how different legal tasks require different choices. He ultimately recommends that we develop hybrid models. The Computational project talks about two categories, data-driven law and code-driven law, and often concludes that each category is problematical, but for different reasons. And there's a similar dichotomy in the recent history of natural language processing. So this was natural language processing circa 2010. It's a pipeline architecture from a natural language sentence to a syntactic parse, to a semantic interpretation, and optionally, an expression in a logical language. And that was the framework in which I was working when I wrote my ICALE paper in 2007. In that project, we followed the pipeline to compute a semantic interpretation of the full text of the judicial opinions of 102 cases in the US Court of Appeals, Second and Third Circuits. And the results were pretty good. But in 2009, working with a student, Tim Armstrong, we tried the same approach with a statute, the Uniform Commercial Code, and the results were poor overall. So we never wrote a full paper on this work, but just presented a short report in a workshop at ICALE 2009. However, if you look more closely at that project, what you will see is that the results varied substantially with sentence structure. So core phrase structure, that worked pretty well. Coordinated conjunctions, and, or, etc., very bad. Prepositional phrase attachment, also very bad. So let's look at this pipeline in a little more detail. We used Michael Collins' statistical parser from his dissertation in 1999. Now, this parser was revolutionary when it first appeared, since previous parsers were based on hand-coded grammars. For the semantic interpretation, I wrote a definite clause grammar, DCG, in Prolog to map the parse tree into a quasi-logical form, QLF. It was hand-coded, non-stochastic, and consisted of approximately 700 rules. Translations into my language for legal discourse, LLD, were written by hand and were not previously published, but I presented several UCC examples in my talk at ProLaw 2022 just a few weeks ago. And I will repeat one of these examples here. So this is the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 3, Negotiable Instruments, Section 501(b)(3. Without dishonoring the instrument, the party to whom presentment is made may, 1, return the instrument for lack of a necessary endorsement, or 2, refuse payment or acceptance for failure of the presentment to comply with the terms of the instrument, an agreement of the parties, or other applicable law or rule. Note that this sentence includes the modal auxiliary may. So we'll return to that. Now here is the quasi-logical form, QLF, for the first part of the sentence through Roman numeral 1, computed automatically. Syntactically, there is a composition of 4 kinds of prologue terms. S term, which you can see there, is the main relation in a sentence. N term is an object, usually a noun phrase. A term is a unary predicate, usually an adjective or adverb, and P term is a binary relation, usually a prepositional phrase. Terms can have pre-modifiers, denoted by the single ampersand, and post-modifiers, double ampersand, with variables that match. And this QLF is correct. You can check the prepositional phrase attachments for without and for the P terms there and see that they are attached to the S term return. You know that they're attached because they share the logical variable B in that representation. And here is the translation of the main components of that QLF into my language for legal discourse, LLD. Presentment, dishonor, endorsement, instrument, etc. are terms of art in Article 3 with statutory definitions. To write this translation, we need a type system for these terms. Now, I would encourage you to look at the slides and notes for my Pro La La talk for more details on QLF and LLD and for more statutory examples. Here is the second part of Section 501(b)(3), which is not correct. There are two mistakes. First, the prepositional phrase for failure of, presentment, etc., is attached to acceptance, and it should be attached to refuse. Second, the sequence of ors is in the wrong place, completely out of place. But it would be fairly easy to build an interactive system in which we could click on these, on the incorrect structures and move them into the correct positions. It is simple to fix this example manually. Here is the corrected quasi-logical form. And here is the translation of the components into LLD. You can see the annotation modal may in the QLF way down in the lower left corner. And because of the modal may, this provision of the UCC grants a permission to take a disjunctive action. And since we are using a free choice permission in this language in LLD, this is equivalent to a conjunction of permissions for each action. Here is the first permission for Roman numeral 1, condition, an action, and an actor. And the conditions, etc., refer to the components of the LLD of that you saw previously. And the second permission for Roman numeral 2. Once we have a statutory provision in this form, we can compute inferences using various logics for events and actions, permissions and obligations, and other modalities such as knowledge and belief. Again, take a look at the slides and notes from my Pro La La talk for more examples. I also proposed a methodology for a rules as code project in my Pro La La talk. First, define a type system for the statutory domain. Second, refine this mapping iteratively, English to QLF to LLD. And if we write the DCGs properly, they will be bidirectional, and we can invert the mapping as shown here. Now, in a project to translate statutory rules into code, my opinion is we should preserve these mappings. This is maximal isomorphism. But we do have this question about the accuracy of the parser. Can we improve the accuracy of the parser? And we'll come back to this question in a bit. But here's natural language processing circa 2020. It's completely different. It's a neural network organized as a transformer with an encoder stack on the left and a decoder stack on the right. The network computes an end-to-end mapping from an input sequence to an output sequence, which are both represented as embeddings in a vector space. The attention mechanism computes associations between tokens in both sequences, and self-supervised learning is implemented by masking out tokens in the output. Once trained on a corpus, the network can be fine-tuned on a task, such as retrieving similar sentences from legal texts. One of the best current examples is parallel search by Casetext, and I want to thank Pablo Arredondo for giving me access to their system. So here is a query based on UCC section 501(b)(3. Without dishonoring the instrument, the party to whom presentment is made may refuse payment or acceptance for failure of the presentment to comply with other applicable law or rule. These are the top 3 hits. The first 2 are close paraphrases. The third is an exact quote from the statute. Now, this may not be the best example of parallel search, since you can find statutes by searching for the citation itself, but it is worth noting that a keyword search on this query retrieves junk. More than 1,000 hits, and a manual inspection of the top 100 reveals nothing relevant. Well, let's look at the text of the third case that was retrieved, Messing versus Bank of America. What you see is dense statutory analysis, part of which is shown here. The opinion cites the section that we're looking at and the prior section in full, and then writes the following. The question is whether requiring a thumbprint constitutes a request for reasonable identification under section 501B2(2). If it is reasonable, then under 501B3(2), the refusal of the bank to accept the check from petitioner did not constitute dishonor. If, however, requiring a thumbprint is not reasonable under 501B2(2), then the refusal to accept the check may constitute dishonor under 502B2. So the conclusion is a logical inference from the statute, but it turns on whether a request for a thumbprint is a request for, quote, reasonable identification, and that is a classic example of an open textured concept. This is where parallel search shines. Let's try a query that combines the open texture concept with specific facts. A bank may require a thumbprint as reasonable identification for the presentment of a check. Not surprisingly, the first several hits are cites to Messing and to one case that quotes from Messing. And here are the next three. Note that the first case on this list to the left is from 1915, well before the Uniform Commercial Code was drafted, but it is describing a similar situation. Now, if you're looking for more specific facts, we can vary the query slightly to generate different search results. And without going through all the details, here are two citations that are factually on point. And just a point to note, Engler versus City of Bothell, the second case here, happens to be a fingerprint case that cites Messing. So it's definitely factually similar. Now, what we've seen in this example is a very common pattern. Most legal analysis today starts with a statute or a regulation, which requires logical inferences from legal rules, and then bottoms out with an inquiry into a fact-specific open textured concept. And there's a gap here, as you can see, between machine learning and logical rules. Can we bridge this gap? Well, several things to try. The first approach that I would try would be to work with existing systems and try to reconfigure them. So here's one strategy. Start with the pipeline architecture and ask, can we use transformer-based neural networks to improve the accuracy of the parser? That was the stumbling block, remember? Well, there is some current research that says yes. I've tried the Berkeley neural parser on my UCC examples, and the parse trees are much better, but not perfect. On 501B3, the ORs are correct, but the prepositional phrase attachment is still incorrect. Another strategy, start with the transformer-based neural network and ask, can we modify the architecture to compute logical expressions in something like a language for legal discourse? Well, there is work in this direction too, which is basically mapping a sequence of tokens to a structured representation. For statutory texts, though, we may not have the structured data we need for self-supervised learning. Nevertheless, research on these approaches is important. But in the remainder of my presentation, I will shift gears radically and talk about a theoretical synthesis. This is the high-level view: probability, geometry, logic. There have been many proposals over the years to combine probability and logic as a foundation for AI. For example, Nils Nilsson in 1986, Pedro Domingos in 2006. What is new here is geometry. The geometric model itself is not novel. Take a look at two books on cognitive science by Peter Gardenforth, Conceptual Spaces, published in 2000, and The Geometry of Meaning, published in 2014, both of which I recommend very highly. What is novel, I think, is the connection between probability and geometry at the bottom and the connection between geometry and logic at the top. Remember, transformers compute probabilities over vector spaces. But vector spaces are linear, and what we need, in my opinion, are non-linear manifolds. Now, there's some heavy-duty math here, but I'm going to present the cartoon version. No equations, just pictures. This is an artificial three-dimensional example generated by a sixth-degree polynomial. Think of this as the representation of a probability density with the mode, that is the maximal point, at the origin. You are looking here at a two-dimensional surface of constant probability. I call this example a curvilinear Gaussian. We assume that the probability density is generated by a stochastic process known as Brownian motion with a drift term. Brownian motion by itself dissipates. That is, it spreads outwards until the probability density everywhere is zero. But in this figure, we see a gradient vector field pointing back towards the origin that counteracts the dissipative effect of the Brownian motion. At equilibrium, the steady state probability density is exactly the curvilinear Gaussian shown in the previous slide. And we're going to use this gradient vector field to define a coordinate system for our geometric model. I call this prototype coding. You measure the distance from the prototype, the rho coordinate, in several possible directions, the theta coordinates. The rho coordinate follows the gradient vector field from the previous slide, and it has a Riemannian dissimilarity metric defined on it, which depends on the probability density. The principal axis, shown here between the red and the black dots, is the rho coordinate curve that has a minimal Riemannian distance for a fixed Euclidean distance. The theta coordinates are geodesics on the surface of constant probability density, and they are a constant Riemannian distance from the origin. So I hope you can get that, at least intuitively, from this diagram. Now, this is the same picture of the theta 1 and theta 2 coordinates, but now I have generated 1,000 random data points according to the curvilinear Gaussian probability density and projected them along the rho coordinate curves to the surface of constant probability. You can see that the data is clustered around the theta 2 coordinate curve. So if we wanted to use only one theta coordinate curve to represent this data, which one would we choose? Theta 2, obviously, because the reconstruction error would be less. The optimal two-dimensional coordinate system for this data would be rho theta 2, not rho theta 1. Finally, this is an illustration of two curvilinear Gaussians, translated and rotated. For the probability density, we construct a mixture of the two. Let's refer to these as prototypical clusters. And that concludes the artificial three-dimensional example of what I will call the theory of differential similarity. But let's now look at two real examples, two classical image processing examples. MNIST, shown here, and CIFAR-10, which is a data set of small, low-resolution, full-color photographs in 10 categories. Now, these examples are handled quite well by supervised deep neural networks. But why? Why do neural networks, deep neural networks, work? One conjecture is the manifold hypothesis, which asserts that natural data in high-dimensional spaces is actually concentrated on low-dimensional, nonlinear submanifolds. We can explore this hypothesis using the theory of differential similarity. Now, in this figure, an architecture for deep learning on the MNIST data set, you follow the arrows from the lower left corner around to the upper right corner. And what you'll see is the first step is to scan and sample the image and compute or extract 7x7 patches. So that would be a 49-dimensional data point. And then we're going to use the theory of differential similarity to reduce the dimensionality and encode that patch in, it's an arbitrary choice, but let's say 12 dimensions. We then can put 4 12-dimensional patches together in a 2x2 matrix, scan again, 48 dimensions, reduce the dimensionality, 12 dimensions, and so on. I could show you the MNIST example, but because of time constraints, let's jump directly to CFAR 10. As in MNIST, we sample 7x7 patches from each image, but since there are 3 color channels, red, green, blue, each patch is a point in a space of 3 times 49 equals 147 dimensions. Now, here are 50 prototypes for the CFAR 10 example, for the CFAR 10 patches, I should say. And remember, these are the modes of 50 prototypical clusters. Here are the row coordinate curves along the principal axis for 7 of these prototypes. The prototype itself is on the right. We are computing these curves separately in each color channel in 47 dimensions each, and then combining the results into full color patches. We now project a sample of the patches along the row coordinate curves to the surface of constant probability density, exactly as we did in the 3-dimensional example. And what do we see? We see several empirical clusters. Here are the modes of 6 clusters for prototype 14. The first row is the original patch. The second row is the projection onto the 3 surfaces of constant probability density. The third row is a projection onto the submanifold defined by the 11 best theta coordinate curves in each color channel. Combined with the row coordinate curves, we now have 3 12-dimensional submanifolds. Here are the modes of 6 clusters for prototype 32, just to give you another example, with the same explanation as in the previous slide. Now, for each prototype, we combine the 3 12-dimensional manifolds into a 36-dimensional product manifold and repeat the entire process to compute an optimal 12-dimensional submanifold for each cluster. And here are the results. Choosing new random patches from prototypical clusters 14 and 32, we show the mapping from 147 dimensions down to an optimal 12 dimensions. And you can see that the general shape and color balance is preserved, which is the result that we want. That's a qualitative result, but there are quantitative results using reconstruction error that also validate that procedure. So that's the connection between probability and geometry. But what is the connection between geometry and logic? Let's review the main procedure in the MNIST and CFAR 10 examples. We construct the product manifold from the encoded values of the smaller patches, and then we construct a submanifold using the Riemannian dissimilarity metric. For example, this is the top line in the MNIST architecture that I showed you before. So let's translate this into a logic. We write the product manifold as a logical product and write the submanifold as a logical predicate, an atomic formula. Here, as you can see, this is at the bottom of the slide, I'm using the syntax of my language for legal discourse, which you saw before. Now, in classical logic, patch 23, patch 14, etc., would be interpreted as sets, and image 4, the predicate, would be interpreted as a subset of the Cartesian product of the patches. So in general, I'm replacing a logic based on sets and their elements with a logic based on manifolds and their points. For this interpretation, we need a logical language based on category theory. We define a category by specifying its objects and its morphisms. The category set, the objects are abstract sets, the morphisms are arbitrary mappings. The category top, the objects are topological spaces, the morphisms are continuous mappings, and in the category man, which is the one we are principally interested in, the objects are differential manifolds, and the morphisms are smooth mappings. In different categories, you get a different logic: classical, intuitionistic, and, well, as far as I know, a logic based on the category man has not previously been discussed in the literature, but let's call it a manifold logic. Now, this is kind of scary. This is what a definition looks like in category theory. I will not try to explain it, except to make two comments. First, a categorical object, such as a product, is only defined up to isomorphism. And the isomorphism depends on the category. So in the category man, the categorical product is isomorphic to the product manifold. The second point, in man, everything in the diagram is either a manifold or a smooth mapping on manifolds. And thus, the logical definition here is just a restatement of a proposition about geometry. This is a definition of a subobject, and the same two comments apply. In particular, in the category man, the logical definition is just a restatement of a proposition about manifolds and smooth mappings on manifolds. Here are more definitions, which I will not explain in detail. The initial object 0 is the empty manifold, which is interpreted in the logic as false. The terminal object 1 is the zero-dimensional manifold consisting of a single point, which is interpreted in the logic as true. Let's now take a quick look at the proof theory, which is based on a sequent calculus. A sequent is interpreted as saying, from the expression on the left of the turnstile, you can prove the expression on the right. But here the sequent itself is interpreted as a morphism. So look at the line at the top, which has 1 to the left of the turnstile. This is saying there is a mapping from 1, the singleton set, to control, which means that control is non-empty, in other words, true. And the second line, which has 0 to the right of the turnstile, says there is a mapping from control to 0, the empty set, so control itself must be empty. That is false. And here is an example of a sequent with 3 variables and its interpretation as a morphism from the manifold Q to control. Remember, the logic is just a restatement of various geometric propositions about manifolds and smooth mappings on manifolds. Finally, some proof rules. From the sequence above the line, you can infer the sequence below the line. Here are 2 rules for cut and for conjunction. And this is enough for Hornclaw's logic program. Again, the logic is just a restatement of various geometric propositions about manifolds and smooth mappings on manifolds. Here are some references to what I've been talking about. And this is my last slide. What is it saying? We have seen how a knowledge representation language can be grounded in a prototypical perceptual semantics. But why would we say it is learnable? Well, the proof theory carries the probabilistic geometrical structures up through the higher levels of the logic. And thus the computations that we saw at the perceptual level can also be applied to abstract concepts. That's the key idea, but I must say it has yet to be proven. This is work in progress, hence the question mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor McCarthy. That was really quite a lot to take in, if I may say so myself. Do we have any questions from anyone? Yes, David. I think you can unmute. Oh, yeah, Brett, are you raising your hand? We have a question in the chat. Do you want to read that? Yeah, so the question is, there is a great deal of theoretical sophistication here. For those whose interests lie closer to software apps, is there code available for download?
So it's not currently available for download. I have a lot of code, which is fairly experimental and therefore fairly chaotic, I must say. So it needs quite a bit of work to get it into shape for other people to use it, including commenting and such. I intend to do that, but it's not available at the moment. I will make it available. Everything that I showed, now I have, if you look at the, if you check out the references that I gave it in the last slide, there's quite a lot of mathematics, but there's also a lot of code. There's fragments of code in the paper itself.
And I think we have a follow-up question from Ming as well.
Okay, so there's a follow-up question, if I have this right. This is from Meng Wang, yes? He then asks, does the code automatically infer an ontology type system? Well, okay. The code, all right, the code is current. We have to be clear about what we mean by the code. The code that I was, for the graphical, the image processing examples, that code has nothing to do with the logic, okay? That's just the probabilistic geometric model. And when you asked in the previous comment, is the code available? And I said, well, it's experimental and it's somewhat messy. It was the probabilistic geometric code that I was talking about. So that does not involve a connection to the logic or the type theory. The code in the earlier examples, when I was talking about the pipeline architecture, the definite clause grammar, so that code has not been made available, but it could be made available. Okay, it hasn't been touched since about 2000. Hasn't been modified since about 2009, and that does not automatically infer a type system, but it can use a type system if you specify that type system. So I'm basically talking about a lot of additional work that has to be done to put these various pieces together. And that's why I say it's a work in progress. By the way, to follow that up, I would really be happy to have collaborators on this. So one of the issues for me right now is that having retired from teaching some few years back, I don't have easy access to graduate students, and I don't have easy access to research grants to support the graduate students. I previously did, but don't now. So if any of you have some good graduate students who are interested in some interesting projects, I have a lot of good ideas. I think that a good graduate student could work with quite successfully. So that I'll sort of conclude with that. Thank you. Thank you for your questions, man.